Hey everyone, we are starting a deep dive into the Gospel of Matthew this week on the podcast, and we're so excited to share it with you.
We thought you might want to see a behind-the-scenes look at us recording the podcast, and so we are making some video versions of the podcast available. The first one is this one right here. If you want to get video versions of the podcast every week, you can join us over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/queertheology. Otherwise, just keep on listening to wherever you've listened to your podcasts. Hello. It feels so good and also so weird to be back on the podcast microphone. We've been really enjoying the past few months of amazing interviews. And also, I feel like I'm a little out of practice for doing these more Bible-based podcasts, just the two of us. We recorded everything before winter break, and so it's been 2 months since we've recorded one of these bad boys. And so I'm excited to get back in. Anything that you want to share, like before we dive in, Shay, like what's been going on with you?
Yeah, I've also been really enjoying the interviews. It's just so fun to get to be in conversation with people that are doing such incredible work in the world. I think especially mid the never-ending pandemic, it can feel really isolating to be doing any kind of creative work or thoughtful work, and so connecting with other people has just been really beautiful. And also, I'm excited to be back with just the two of us diving deep into scripture. Like, that feels really exciting too.
Yeah, we've been prepping for this 8-part series on Matthew, which we're about to dive into. We're going to sort of, each one of us is going to alternate on taking the lead on the episode. But as I was prepping for next week's episode, which we'll get to next week, obviously, I was just like reminded how much I really love diving into sacred scripture and unpacking it and finding, what it has to say about our lives today. And, whatever you believe about scripture or Jesus or Christianity, I think, if you were raised Christian and you're still religious in some way or spiritual in some way, there's a lot of power here in not being scared by it, by sort of like staring it dead in the eyes and saying, like, what does this mean? What has this meant for other people? And what might this mean for me? And so, yeah, I'm just super jazzed. So, Shay, we're doing an 8-part series all on the Gospel of Matthew. This was your idea. Why did you want to do this? And then I guess let's dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of us have felt over the years that just taking small passages out of context, like often the lectionary does, or even when we've tried to do a deeper dive, but we've only tried to do it in like 3 weeks, there just wasn't enough time to really talk about all of the juice that is to be found. And I'm gonna say, like, we're doing Matthew in 8 parts, and it's still not enough time. Like, we're really having to cram a lot of chapters into each podcast episode, so like bear with us on that. But I do think that it's important to be able to look at a text and to read it in its entirety and to understand what the author of that text was trying to communicate to their community, and that you can really only do that by looking at it as a whole thing. And so I'm excited about this. And we should also note that we're trying something a little bit different. And for anyone who is a supporter of ours on Patreon or who is a member of Sanctuary Collective, you're going to get a special worksheet that will go with each episode that has the text, that has some journaling prompts, that has some action items, and that has some further resources if you want to dive even deeper. So if you're interested in getting those worksheets, you can become a supporter on Patreon. That's patreon.com/queertheology, or by becoming a member of Sanctuary Collective. And you can find out more about Sanctuary Collective at queertheology.com/community.
All right. And so, like, where do we even begin with the Gospel of Matthew, the first gospel in the Christian New Testament? Yeah.
Yeah, so today's episode, we're going to look at both a really kind of broad overview of the historical and political background, the audience, some of the context that the Gospel of Matthew was written in. And then we're also going to take a look at the first 2 chapters. So lots and lots of ground to cover. And so here we go. So the first thing to note is that each of the 4 gospel accounts that we have, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were each written to a particular community in a particular time. And for those of us that grew up evangelical, that were taught to read the Bible as inerrant, as an infallible, I think many of us were also taught to just like squash all four of the Gospels together and try to make them into one giant mushy story. And like if it felt like there were contradictions, we just like ignored those or we explained them away. And so the first thing that we're going to do in this podcast series is to not do that. That we are looking at just the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to take it for what it is, and we're going to just look at what's there and not look at what's not. And so as we're introduced to these stories, we have to understand that whoever was writing this was writing and telling the stories that were most vital for their own communities to hear. And so that starts us off with who was Matthew written by. And Matthew was not written by Matthew. And so that's another thing that, like, if you grew up in the evangelical church, you were taught that each of the Gospels was written by the gospel it was named after. And that's just not true. No scholar really thinks that. So
and I
it was
also,
probably
even if you weren't raised evangelical, you were raised Catholic or like just a mainline, you might not have been taught this sort of like scholarship about the Bible. And so I think a lot of like, I think you asked a random person on the street who wasn't particularly Christian, you know, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, they'd be like, well, Matthew, obviously.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and so it was probably, scholars think that this was an anonymous compiler who wrote these texts, and that at some point it was named after Matthew. So as we talk about Matthew as the writer of Matthew, we're doing that as a shorthand, not because we think that Matthew actually wrote the text. So I might refer to the author of Matthew or simply Matthew as a shorthand, but again, anonymous compiler. Scholars think that this text was probably written between 80 and 90 CE in Antioch, and that Matthew was compiled from several different sources. It's thought to be created in a Christian community that's still really heavily intertwined with Judaism. And so I think that this is like a really important framing point, and you're going to hear us say this over and over and over and over again over the next 8 weeks, that this community did not consider themselves separate from Judaism. They considered themselves as a stream within it. And this is really important because there are a lot of texts in Matthew that seem to rail against Jewish religious leaders, Jewish folks in general. And this text has been used for years to bolster and excuse anti-Semitism. And so it's vital that, especially as people who consider ourselves Christian that are reading these texts, that we're not inadvertently feeding into that. And so as this community is talking about issues with religious leadership, they're having an intra-communal conversation. It's like if you can imagine different Christian denominations arguing with one another, like haven't we seen that a million times?
Not hard to imagine.
And it's saying, you know, like, you have it right on this, or you have it wrong on this, and we have it right. And so, like, these are the conversations that are happening. Matthew's community was probably a relatively wealthy urban community. And this matters because it impacts how Matthew treats teachings about money and wealth. And he changes them kind of in some subtle ways from Mark. And so that's also important to know. Okay, so that's a bunch of background. Brian, anything you want to add or ask or say?
Yeah, I think that I would just add that it's important to note that a lot of this was an intra-community dialogue, argumentation that many, if not most, if not all of the sort of community of Jesus followers at this time consider themselves to be Jewish. Like, it's 2,000 years later, right? And so, like, Christianity is now no longer part of Judaism. It is like that was decisively decided, you know, shortly after these Gospels were compiled. And we also have like 2,000 years of history to look back and see. You know, we can understand maybe how these debates and disagreements came about, but also to look back to see how they've been used over the course of 2,000 years. And I think, like, it can be really tempting for Christians to try and, like, circumvent 2,000 years of, like, violent Christianity and bullshit to say like, oh, well, like back at the beginning, it was like pure. And I just want to like, I'm a Jesus follower. Like, I want to just sort of like jettison my Christianity from the past 2,000 years. And I think like we have to recognize that like we're part of this tradition that dates back all the way. And so we're like both wrestling with like Jesus then, but we're also wrestling with like Jesus throughout the ages and Jesus today.
We need to hang on one second. I had put a whole bunch of other notes in here and they're gone.
Oh no. Oh, hey, I lost you for a second, but
I was just saying, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah.
I put a whole bunch more notes in here this morning, and they're gone.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna... I have some notes in another doc, so I'm gonna try to... So, sorry, Ryan, you'll have to cut this out. Okay, so as we dive into looking at the actual text of Matthew's Gospel, today we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2. I want to read a quote from Matthew and the Margins by Warren Carter, because I think it's important that we keep this in mind as we frame this entire text. And he says, Matthew's Gospel is a counter-narrative. It is a work of resistance written from and for a minority community of disciples committed to Jesus, the agent of God's saving presence and empire. The Gospel shapes their identity and lifestyle as an alternative community. And I think that this is really important because Matthew's Gospel is really about the idea of discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple? And also, what does it mean to live in the context of empire and oppression and a world that doesn't recognize the God that you follow? Like, how do you do that? What does it look like to live in that way and to live in that type of community? And so everything that Matthew is doing, all of the stories that Matthew is telling, are all about trying to shape the idea and the lifestyle of discipleship for this community. And so you'll have lots of questions around ethics, around how do we behave, around what do we do. And so that is a really important framing part. And so Matthew's Gospel starts with I think a text that most people skip over, and that's the genealogy of Jesus. And so we have this really long genealogy of who begat whom and who fathered whom. And the thing that always jumps out at me as someone who has spent a lot of time reading the Bible is that this is a genealogy that is designed to subvert people's expectations. In that, in the midst of it, there are 5 women who are named. And the naming of those women does something really interesting to the audience that hears it. And I think the other important note is, as we dive into these 5 women, are that anyone hearing these stories is very, very familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. Because they're part of Judaism. And so when Matthew is talking about fulfillment of scripture, when Matthew is pulling out sentences or phrases or names, his audience knows the whole story behind that. And so it's really important that as we start to read these texts, that we actually do our homework to know all of the stories that Matthew is pulling out and is hinting at. And so we have the naming of these 5 women. And again, from Warren Carter, he talks about the fact that we utilize women, that we name women in these texts. It both utilizes but also undermines the dominant system of patriarchy. First, by the inclusion of women, and then in the astonishing account of Mary's conception of Jesus without any male agent. It becomes clear that God works in and through and around male dominance. And so that's another place that we're going to subvert traditional norms of we're going to talk about women. And someone on Instagram asked, how was Jesus shaped by patriarchy? And it's Jesus was obviously shaped by patriarchy. These texts are shaped by patriarchy. We can't escape that it was in a patriarchal system, that we're still in a patriarchal system. And also these texts like push back against that in some really subtle and interesting ways. And that feels really exciting to me as someone who is often reading scripture from the margins, that we can see how, you know, this is a system that is like dealing with patriarchy and also trying to subvert it at the same time. Okay, so the 5 women named in the genealogy of Jesus are Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, Bathsheba, although Bathsheba is not named in Matthew. She's called the wife of Uzziah, and then Mary. And each of these 5 women have a hint of sexual scandal somewhere in their story. Tamar tricked her father-in-law to father a child, mostly because the father-in-law wasn't doing his correct duty to care for her. Ruth travels and is a foreigner who declares herself as someone who's going to stay with her mother-in-law, and then seduces Boaz in order to, again, get protection. Rahab is a sex worker who hides Israelite spies, but then becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus. Bathsheba was someone who King David saw her and wanted her, so sent her husband off to die and took her. Many of us were taught that Bathsheba, like, quote unquote, had an affair with David. That is not what happened. She was preyed upon by David. David is not the hero of that story. But that's a podcast for another day. And then, of course, we have the story of Mary, who has a baby out of wedlock, like not married to Joseph. And we can imagine that as people heard the story that Mary was pregnant, that they also had this sense of sexual scandal around her, and had a lot of questions about where this baby came from. And so the inclusion of these 5 women are really important in Jesus's genealogy. And also, though, in Matthew, the genealogy and the birth narrative really focuses on Joseph. Like, we don't get Mary doing the Magnificat. We don't get the angel coming to Mary. We only get Joseph. Joseph is the only one who kind of has agency in this story. The angel appears to Joseph, not to Mary. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic. And it's something that is lost when we try to jam all of the birth narratives together. Anything you want to add there, Brian?
Yeah. So, like, what do you make of that focus on Joseph in Matthew's account?
I mean, I think what it's coming from is that Joseph, or that the author of Matthew is trying really hard to trace Jesus's genealogy specifically to the line of David, and also to trace, you know, Jesus through like these series of prophets and foreigners, and all of that becomes really important later on in Matthew's gospel. But I think that specifically this like tracing Jesus back to King David was really vital, and that he had to do that through Joseph. And so he's focusing on that in order to make the claim that Jesus is a new king in the line of David who will, you know, deliver the people. And we see also that like Matthew is tracing Jesus's story to all of the major figures in the Jewish tradition that like were liberatory. So we're going to see a lot of references to Jesus as the new Moses, for instance. Jesus as a prophet in the line of prophets, Jesus as a king in the line of David. And so these are all like big points that the author is trying to make.
Yeah, I think that is an important to underscore, that I know growing up, I was sort of taught this genealogy of Jesus was to prove that Jesus, like, quote unquote, fulfilled all of the like requirements and prophecies of the Jewish Messiah. And it was really just sort of like establishing this like theological claim. And I think now, knowing all of this new information, that it's perhaps less about, or that's part of the equation, but it's also about like making a political claim, like, right, he's like descendant of a king, he's heir to an actual throne. Like you were saying, all these connections to liberatory figures, that this is a gospel. This is like, like religio-political propaganda. Like he's making the case of like, this is who this Jesus is, and this is why he's important. And it was kind of like an aggressive claim to be making.
Yeah, and so again, from Warren Carter, he talks about Mary's virginal conception and uses kind of air quotes around that. The conception by some action of a god actually has a number of parallels in the ancient world. These stories often account for the special abilities and deeds of a great hero. And so while Jesus' conception is unique in breaking the A was the father of B pattern in this genealogy, it's actually not unique in the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And so this is, like you said, this is propaganda. This is making a political point that, like, the author of Matthew is equating Jesus not just with all of the greats of Jewish history, but also in opposition to the great leaders of Rome. And, like, that's really important, and is going to become even more important as this text goes on.
Yeah.
And okay, great. So I think that covers the genealogy. All right. So, quick dive. That was the genealogy, chapter 1. Now we're going to move into chapter 2, which is talking about the Magi. And, again, I think that our kind of cutesy Christmas pageants do a disservice to teaching how to read the Bible appropriately, because when we jam together shepherds and the Magi and angels, like, we're actually not talking about what the point that the author is trying to make. And so in Matthew, we don't have any shepherds. We just have the Magi. We have these foreigners, right, who are the ones who are able to see the importance of Jesus, who are the ones who recognize Jesus's importance. They're kind of set against the religious and political leaders of the day who, like, don't recognize the importance of Jesus. And also, right from the very beginning of Matthew's story, the birth of Jesus is centered on a threat to religious and to political power. And this is really, really important because this is going to continue to be a theme and a thread throughout the Gospels. And so one thing that I found really interesting is that when the Magi come, so they've been studying this star, and again, the idea of a star that shows up around an important ruler's birth is not new. Like, that isn't just something that maybe presumably happened with Jesus. Like, in the ancient world, there were lots of figures who it was said that a star got brighter when they were born, or a star appeared when they were born, or a star went out when they died, right? So this idea of people studying the heavens, looking for signs is not new. It's not unique to Jesus. And also, it does say that Jesus is in the line of all of these other really important political figures for whom a star would appear or disappear. And that when the Magi come and they see Herod, they say that they have come to worship this child whom the star has foretold, that they've come to worship this king. And it's interesting, Warren Carter talks about how this term that they use for worship is a political one, which designates the prostration required, especially as you would greet a ruler. And the Magi don't offer that to King Herod. So it's clear,
spicy,
right from the get-go, right, that they've made their choice about who deserves their homage, who deserves their worship, who deserves their supplication, and that they choose Jesus, not Herod. And that's important. And then when they ask, like, where is this baby born? Herod calls together the religious leaders, and they immediately name Bethlehem of Judea. And the other piece that we're going to see a lot in Matthew is that everything circles around Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the important place. Jerusalem is the seat of power, and any other place and personnel are marginal. They're outside. And so to talk about the small town of Bethlehem as the site of Jesus's birth, talks about like how power and salvation is coming from the margins, not from the center of power. And it's important to note that Matthew was probably written after the destruction of the temple. And so Matthew's community, again, intracommunal conversations, they are part of the Jewish community. They see the destruction of the temple as a punishment for not having believed in the right way. And Matthew is interpreting that as not having believed in Jesus, not in the same way that like crazy evangelicals interpret that, right? And so it's, again, important. This is an intercommunal conversation, and that Matthew is saying that he believes that Jesus is really important, and that part of what is part of why there is conflict is because that other people didn't recognize Jesus's importance. And I think that we can say that that is what's happening in the text, while also not extrapolating that out to become problematic and harmful today.
So I have a question for you, Shay. So you mentioned that like what we are not doing in this episode is sort of like smushing together multiple birth stories about Jesus, where there's like shepherds and there's angels and there's magi, because you were saying that like we miss out on something. And I could imagine someone at home listening to this, thinking like, well, like Matthew says that there was magi and Luke says that there were shepherds, and so like, were they not both there? Like, what do you mean? Or like, which one, which one happened? Or did neither of them happen? Or did they both happen at just like at different times? Like, so can we just like take a little bit of a side to be like, what is a gospel and what are these birth stories like doing?
Yeah, I mean, the real truth is that like we don't know what happened, obviously. And these texts they're not meant to be designed as history texts. They're not meant to be designed to be an account of here's exactly what happened. I think that one could maybe, if they wanted to, make the case that shepherds appeared in the barn or cave when Jesus was born. And like, because many traditions have that it took the Magi 2 years to follow this star and to go on a journey, and that by the time they found Jesus, he was like a toddler in a house. So one could make that claim, right? That both stories matter or quote unquote happened. For me, it doesn't actually matter what historically happened. What matters is what the author is trying to get across by telling the story in this way. And what happens in these texts is that an author is trying to make a claim about the uniqueness of Jesus, but also to put Jesus's uniqueness in conversation with other political and religious leaders around the same time, to say, yeah, so-and-so also said that they were born of a virgin, but did they have a star? Like, Jesus has all of those things, right? And so I think that that's important, that this is, Matthew's trying to make a claim about who Jesus is and what his birth means. And again, we need to understand that Matthew is not the first thing that's written. It's the first gospel that we have in our, Americanized New Testament, or Englishized, or however you want to say that. But that Mark is probably the earliest of the gospel accounts written. And in Mark, there are no birth narratives. We don't get anything until Jesus appears on the scene as a prophet. And so part of what might be happening is that people were starting to try to discount Mark And so Matthew, who uses Mark as one of his source texts, is saying, oh, actually, we have to go back farther. It wasn't just that Jesus was a great prophet. Jesus had a special birth too, right? That he's making these claims about the uniqueness of Jesus, and that's really important.
I love it.
And so we have this story of the Magi coming, and they visit Jesus. They offer him worship. Then they're warned in a dream. Again, angels are coming and warning them in a dream, and they go back home another way. Herod is like spooked by this whole story and orders the murder of all of the children under the age of 2 years old to try to wipe out this threat. So again, we have this author who's trying to make a point right from the get-go that Jesus isn't just a religious figure. Jesus is a threat to political powers, and that Jesus is saying that, like, there are two kingdoms here, and you have to choose which one you're going to be a part of. And that goes back to the conversations about discipleship, like, and that goes back to conversations about discipleship, right? Like, how is it that we live in the midst of these two kingdoms? At the end of chapter 2, Joseph is warned in a dream to take the family to Egypt. And again, we have this sense of Jesus then becoming a new Moses, right? Continuing on the tradition of Moses, that he's going to come out of Egypt in order to lead the people.
Yeah, and then also just to jump back 1 second, like, not only was Herod, ordering the murder of all of the children, seen as like a political threat, right? That's also a callback to Moses, right? Where Pharaoh was having all of the firstborn males wiped out. Moses manages to survive. Jesus manages to survive. So there's this like literary and theological mirroring happening with these stories about Jesus.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that we never read any text of scripture without the context, right? Like, I was never taught to put these texts in conversation with the Exodus or with any of these other texts, right? And like, you miss so much. How many times did I gloss over the genealogy as something really, really boring because I didn't know all of the stories that were embedded in these names in the genealogy? And I think that, like, it's so vital if you are gonna grapple well with the Bible that you do your homework and you do your work and you really dive in and understand these texts.
Yeah, I think about how, growing up for me, and I know many traditions still today have like an emphasis on a daily quiet time or like reading the Bible regularly. And I think a lot of people, even like queer people or progressive Christians, if they want to come back to reading the Bible, the only sort of like model we have for reading the Bible was like pick up the Bible, either like flip to some random page or find some story that is interesting to you, read it straight through, and then you're done. And then tomorrow you like pick up where you left off and you keep reading the next few chapters and on you go. And you can sort of do all of that in 10 minutes a morning, right? Or there's, Bible plans to read the whole Bible in 1 year. And I think like actually you could spend like a whole week just reading Matthew 1 and 2 with like, if you have like a good academic study Bible, right, you're like looking at the references, flipping back to read about Exodus, or flipping back to read about Moses, flipping forward to read about like other references, that are kind of coming up later in the gospel. And I think like there's one way to look at that where it's like, oh, this is like homework. I just miss being able to like sit down and read and like just like let it speak to me. And like this is like quote unquote too much work. But I think that if you reframe that to like, oh my goodness, you get to sort of immerse yourself in this world and in this story. And like, I was preparing for this episode. I had like one study Bible open and I was like reading Matthew, and then I was using a different study Bible to like flip back to read in Exodus and like like then like flipping forward to Isaiah. Like there's all of these like really cool cross references. It's almost like going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole where you're like following all of the references and looking it up. And I think like if you read slowly and give yourself time to sort of like sink into it and not feel like I have to like get the message from this passage today, otherwise I'm like doing something wrong, like that can also take a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure off of you, that like you have all the time in the world to read just one chapter, just two chapters, just one portion of one chapter. And I think like you'll unlock so much more richness if you sort of take the time to settle in. And so hopefully you'll be reading along with us and taking the time over the next 8 weeks. But also this is, you know, work that you can continue doing even beyond Matthew. And, you know, we're going to do more of these series, and inside of Sanctuary Collective, we have resources to help you sort of like read the Bible more in-depthly. But I think like a big part of this is just sort of like a mindset shift around, like I can just like read it like it's a bedtime story and then be done with it, versus like a whole world that you get to sort of like immerse yourself in.
Yeah, and I think that around that reframing is also that it's not about trying to figure out like, how does this verse taken out of context help me believe differently, right? That like all of this is about orienting our behavior and what it means to be in resistance to empires wherever they may be found, right? And I think that like we talk a lot about the arc of Scripture, and the arc of Scripture, one of the arcs of Scripture can also be this resistance to empire. That like empire bad is pretty much a theme and a thread from Genesis to Revelation. Like, and so as people, especially in the United States, who are living in an empire, learning how to be in but not of is like really vital to our well-being as humans, but also as followers of Jesus. And I think as like moral and just people, like this is important work. And that reframe of like, we're trying to understand what it means to live and to live well and to live with justice in the unjust systems that we find ourselves in. Like that is way more important than, did I read this verse properly, and am I believing the right things?
All right.
So let's do what are we going to do next week, and then also some kind of tag.
Yeah. I'm so excited by all of this. So next week, we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4, if you're feeling a little eager and you want to read ahead. Also, just as a reminder, if you are a supporter on Patreon or a member of Sanctuary Collective, you'll be getting a worksheet to go along with this, some reflection questions, some resources to continue learning, reading, listening. Also, you get the episode a few days in advance, so our Patreon supporters already have listened to this episode by the time this has gone out. You can do that at patreon.com/queertheology or queertheology.com/community. And any sort of like final notes as we tie up our beginning of our journey into the Gospel of Matthew, Shay?
Yeah, you know, if you're looking for a community to do this work with, if you're listening to this and being like, man, I wish that I could read the Bible like this, but I don't know how, or I didn't go to seminary, or like, I can't afford lots and lots of books. The great thing is that there are so many resources that are available for free in order to do some of this work. And we know that some people love to study more in community. And so we're doing a 6-week How to Read the Bible Better circle, which is going to be like a deep dive into both like group Bible study, but also how you can continue this work on your own. We also have some circles for some other areas if you want to, for instance, talk about grief or sexuality. And so if you want to learn more about the circles, you can go to queertheology.com/circles. They're going to start towards the end of February and go through March. We would love to have you join in on a circle that feels right for you.
And we will see you next week.
And don't forget, we've got our support circles starting up later in February. We would love to have you join us for those. You can find out all of the details at queertheology.com/circles, and we hope to see you inside.
See you soon.